A group of 8 international aid agencies say Israel has failed to meet U.S. demands to allow more aid into Gaza. Last month, the Biden administration gave Israel 30 days to increase urgently needed aid for the territory or risk a scaling back of American military support. Well, that deadline expires today. So how much aid is getting into Gaza, and have the past 30 days seen any improvements?
Displaced Palestinians in central Gaza queue for a bowl of lentil soup, a rare hot meal that in many cases will have to feed an entire extended family. The war has destroyed Gaza's farming and fishing industries, leaving the entire population of 2.2 million reliant on food aid. The UN's World Food Programme is the biggest supplier of aid, followed by the Egyptian Red Crescent. Israel records all of the aid it allows into Gaza. Here are Israel's monthly statistics for 2024. They show deliveries dropped in October to their lowest level since the start of the war. Early November saw an improvement, but still way below what the US has called for. Washington wants aid for Gaza to rise to 350 trucks a day. The daily average for October was just 57 trucks, excluding fuel deliveries. UN agencies say even less actually gets distributed due to Israeli restrictions, ongoing fighting and the general chaos. Aid entering Gaza currently passes through the Kerem Shalom crossing in the south and Erez in the north. On Tuesday, Israel said it had opened the Kisufim crossing too, a day before the US deadline to increase aid deliveries. Things are especially bad in the north. Residents in the towns of Jabalia, Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun say they've received no aid at all since Israel began a new offensive there on October 5th. The Israeli army says it was forced to move into the towns to take on Hamas militants, who it says have regrouped there. One man in Jabalia told reporters that most of his family were killed in a strike at the weekend.
This is the bread that they wanted to eat for breakfast. What good is bread if there's no safety or peace? We don't want food, bread or flour. We want safety and peace.
The UN estimates that between 75 and 95,000 people are in northern Gaza, living in dire conditions. Last week, thousands followed Israeli army orders to evacuate Beit Lahia. A UN-backed panel says famine is imminent in northern Gaza, an assessment dismissed as inaccurate by Israel.
Let's get some context here from Michael Lynk, a professor of law at Western University in Ontario, Canada, and previously a UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian Territories. A very warm welcome back to GW. So this deadline for the increase of aid has now expired. The big question is, do you think the Biden administration will, in response, limit military support to Israel?
This remains to be seen. We've witnessed over the past year a number of reports that Israel, in the conduct of its military assault on Gaza, has been breaking international law, committing the allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and of course even genocide. And that hasn't stopped American aid from flowing, even despite internal reports within the State Department saying that Israel is violating international law, and therefore that should demand the cutoff of weaponry. I take it that the letter sent a month ago by the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State was quite serious. They were expecting to see Israel bring up its allowance of daily humanitarian trucks entering into Gaza up to 350. Indeed, aid organizations say that itself is insufficient. What is needed is around 600 trucks daily going in. As your reporters have said, in October, the average was only 57 trucks, and indeed that has fallen to only 22 trucks a day entering into Gaza in the first week of November. So my instinct would be is that the United States would want to show that it's going to back up its word, that it will take steps if Israel hasn't fulfilled the humanitarian demands of the United States. And we're waiting for that announcement sometime in the next day coming from Washington.
And I'm curious what the legal framework will be that the Biden administration will be operating within here. The U.S. has cited laws that can limit or prohibit military assistance to countries that are failing to provide humanitarian assistance to civilians. Who is in charge of ensuring that these laws are implemented? What happens if they're not respected?
Ultimately, this is an executive decision of the American government that usually is in the hands of the Secretary of State. I mean, it always could be overruled by the president, but ordinarily it's the Secretary of State who determines if the Leahy Act, which is the primary piece of American legislation that would govern the flow of weapons to a country who is alleged to be violating international law, would determine it. As I've said, there have been reports that internally there was allegations that Israel had committed violations of international law, thereby triggering the Leahy Act. That was overruled by the Secretary of State. But I suspect we've probably seen his patience thinned over the last month by Israel's inability or refusal to allow sufficient humanitarian aid to enter into Gaza.
Now, also important to note, of course, that this was a deadline set by the Biden administration before the U.S. presidential election. We've got President-elect Donald Trump coming into office, who has indicated he would give Israel perhaps even freer reign. Do you think this Trump administration would be likely to ignore or reverse any decision that Biden might put forward?
One wonders, if you look at the number of things that the first Trump administration had given Israel with respect to moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, the cutting off of aid to the Palestinian Authority, the cutting off of aid to UNRWA, the recognition of the Israeli claim of sovereignty over the Syrian Golan Heights, and the ending of the Iranian nuclear deal. Very few of those were reversed by the Biden administration. I suspect you're going to see even more gifts on the table on offer by the Trump administration when it takes office in January back to Israel. The biggest issue will be whether or not the demand coming from Israel for a green light from Washington to annex parts or all of the West Bank will be heeded by the new Trump administration. This, I think, would be a grave worry by Israel's traditional allies in Europe, and it would meet with great opposition, I think, coming from the global South. But one wonders if so much was given to Israel in the first Trump administration, how much more generous it will be in the second administration.
Professor Lynk, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. That is Professor Michael Lynk from Western University in Ontario. We very much appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Let's speak more with Shaina Low, a spokesperson with the Norwegian Refugee Council, joining us today from Amman, Jordan. Shaina, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We heard in that report there that aid agencies believe Israel has not increased the flow of aid into Gaza. Is that something that your organization would also corroborate?
Yes, not only has Israel not increased the amount of aid going into Gaza, as the report indicated, the amount of aid going into Gaza in the month of October was the lowest point since aid started being delivered in October of last year. This is, as we've seen, needs continue to grow, and the fact that less and less aid is getting in and reaching people in need, it's simply catastrophic.
What does that look like on the ground? Can you give us a sense of what your colleagues see when it comes to aid distribution in Gaza and the people that they're meeting who need it?
Well, there's very little aid coming in, and so it's often chaotic scenes. People are trying the best that they can to deliver and distribute aid in an orderly fashion, but it's incredibly difficult operating there because of the level of desperation. We're also hearing, as we heard in the report, that people say the aid in some ways is useless unless there's a ceasefire, because the needs will continue to grow and there's no relief in sight.
Now, we've heard also that the situation's particularly difficult in the north of Gaza. Warnings of famine there, something that Israel has denied from what you're hearing from people who've seen it with their own eyes. What is your assessment of the situation there?
Well, we haven't been able to send staff into the northernmost part of Gaza, where the communities of Jabalia, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun are under a tremendous siege, where little to no aid has reached in over a month. But what we're hearing from our staff in Gaza City who have met with people who have fled those areas is that it's just scenes of desperation. There's no food, there's no clean water to drink. People are struggling to find anything to survive. The hospitals are besieged. There's no medicine or very little medicine coming in. And for the people who have fled, they often arrive with nothing. They have nothing but what they could carry on their hands, and they have very few safe places to seek shelter in Gaza City.
Now, in addition to a ceasefire, which you and many other aid organizations have called for in order to care for these people, are there other specific things that Israel could do to make access to that aid and its ability to reach people in Gaza easier?
Well, we need an opening of all of the crossings at the same time to allow for a surge of aid. We need Israel to remove the arbitrary restrictions that's preventing certain life-saving aid from reaching Gaza. I heard recently from our colleagues in the shelter cluster that timber that's needed to build makeshift shelters for the 1.9 million Palestinians who have been internally displaced, forcibly displaced, are not allowed in. So we need those restrictions lifted. On top of that, we need to be able to move to all parts of Gaza where civilians are in need, and we need Israel to stop rejecting requests for humanitarian convoys to reach those communities. We also need a restoration of law and order. A surge of aid would help to create those conditions because demand, as supply increases, demand would reduce, and it would become easier for our colleagues to reach communities safely and ensure that they're getting the aid that they need.
Shaina, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on DW. That is Shaina Low with the Norwegian Refugee Council.